My house is old. What is currently the kitchen, master bedroom, and dining room was the original portion of the house, built in the late 1800s around the time the community was being established. The house has grown significantly since then, and my parents bought the house in 1991. After a few years, my mother started having very bad night terrors. They eventually escalated to the point where my mother felt she could no longer stay in the home, and we moved in 1999. My parents kept the home as a rent house, and I bought it off them in 2007. I was pretty much constantly rearranging the master bedroom, now my room, and after about a year, my bed ended up in the same position as my parents had theirs during our last years when we all lived here. I started having night terrors of a man in old-timey clothes sitting on the edge of the bed with a knife. They were so real that I started sleeping with the lights on. The light was the only difference between the dream and reality, and helped me pull myself out of it. This went on for a few months, until I moved the bed and they abruptly stopped. Later on that year, my night terrors came up in conversation with my mother. The look on her face was both recognition and pity. She described the man perfectly, then asked if my night terrors had developed into being buried alive. I said that they hadn't, and she said, "Yeah, I guess it took about 1.5 years for it to get to that." Then I suddenly realized why my mother was so stressed out in those years, and why she hates to visit my home. After that, I began my best trying to research the area, the home, everything I could get my hands on. It wasn't until this last weekend, when at a music festival, an older gentleman asked me, wasn't there a civil war in that area? And gave me my first real lead. I learned that there was a battle in 1862, approximately 3 decades before the original portion of the house was built. About 60 miles north of here, in fact, and the troops likely passed through here on their way to the Gettysburg of the West. Still researching, though. I have no concrete answers. Definitely do not miss the night terrors. Some members of my family built a house in the country back in the early 90s. Strangely, there had historically been houses previously there which had burned down. I don't know if anyone passed in either, but I have my suspicions. As they were building the house, a neighbor approached and plainly told them that their house was going to burn down. It was the first thing anyone ever said to them about their house. The house still does exist and they still live there, but there have always been some weird happenings in the house. The mother was studying for a college test and heard a ball bouncing against the wall in one of the children's rooms. She called for the child to stop throwing the ball, forgetting that they were at school. As she did so, the ball rolled down the bedroom hallway towards the living room and into her line of sight. She was alone in the house. The boy and I were once in his basement room, and we saw the face of something human-like, but completely dull and lifeless in the storm window, the little 18-inch tall window at the ceiling in some basement rooms. There's no way the face could have been there because the storm window is only 18 inches deep and the face was oriented normally. Sleeping in this house is like a real nightmare. As a child, I would feel things brushing my arms and legs when I slept. There was this awful Mrs. Beasley doll that the mother had that I swear would follow you with its head as you walked around. I lived in a haunted house for almost 4 years, from 2013 to 2017. There were 2 separate entities living in that house, a ghost of the previous owner's wife who passed away of cancer, and something more sinister, which I will get into now. The first real occurrence I remember in that house is 2 weeks after we first moved in. Now mind you, we live on a very quiet road, the occupants of the cul-de-sac being mostly elderly. This means there are rarely a lot of cars going up or down, nor is it a through road. Also, The walls of the house are very thick, so you can't hear much when the doors are closed. I'm downstairs at 8 a.m.ish making breakfast, usually as sugar cereal as I have no regard for my health, when all of a sudden I heard the loudest growl in my right ear. It made me jump and scream, running full tilt to my parents' bedroom. Funnily enough, before my scream woke her up, my mother later told me she had a dream of a dark oppressive force stalking into the kitchen and coming up behind me. My mother is a very religious Catholic woman, so she doesn't take these things lightly, nor does she speak about these things lightly. There are even more stories of scary things that have happened. We don't live in that house anymore. My mum blessed the house her way, as well as my dad blessing the house in the traditional Hindu expulsion of spirits. The house would be quiet for 2 weeks, and then like clockwork it would start up again. I'm no expert on the paranormal, but that house had an entity which wasn't human. When I was younger, I lived in this pretty old house in a neighborhood. It was always creaking as old houses tend to do. I've always felt uncomfortable and weird when I'm inside the house, even during the day, and tried to play outside as often as I could. I know I wasn't the only one who felt this weird, creepy vibe, because my mother once asked me to be there with her one night while she was cleaning the kitchen as she felt uncomfortable. This house gave off a lot of bad energy. My parents did not get along, which resulted in a lot of arguments, which must have caused some trauma for me. I was so full of anxiety that I barely spoke to my parents and stuck to myself. Overall, a lot of bad vibes and energy, but in a more of a paranormal stance. There were also times when the TV would turn itself on or off. At some point when my dad was walking down the hallway, I saw a subtle glowing figure following behind him. I even remember falling down my bunk bed twice, and on the second fall, when I got up, I realized my head was somehow under the bed, as if I was being pulled under it. But the main thing that stuck out from living in this house was that I constantly had nightmares, specifically ones that were always held in parts of my house. I had nightmares where there was something in my closet that was trying to come out, and once I woke up and noticed that my closet was slightly slid open. I had another dream where there was something coming out from under the bed, the shed that we had in the backyard that my dad built too. I knew there were 3 of them living there, since there were 3 lines that moved through the tall grass, and they were moving towards me. I'd always wake up in the middle of the night and swore that a shadow had moved across my window at some point. 11 years later, my family finally moved to another home, and stepping into that new house never felt so calming. No creepy feeling that something was home, and no nervousness when alone in the house. I could never imagine going back. But some years later, my mum had a friend that by some odd chance moved into that same house. My mum asked her if it ever felt weird inside the house, and even her friend agreed that she never felt comfortable while she was alone in there. My parents got divorced when I was about 12. Some minor things happened in the first few places we lived in. We moved into this apartment complex when I was about 14. The manager ever so kindly let us know that the previous tenant passed away. Well, isn't that just lovely? So in that apartment a lot of weird stuff happened. Once a big glass Pyrex measuring cup fell off the counter and shattered on the floor. I had made sure I put it down no less than 5 inches away from the edge. My cat had been sleeping on the couch the entire time. My cat used to mess up the lower cabinet doors, making them open a bit then close with a bang. One night I woke up because the cabinet doors were banging around. I got up, dragged my exhausted ass to the kitchen and yelled at her to stop. But I didn't see her anywhere in the kitchen. And then I remembered she wasn't even in my apartment. We had taken her up to my grandmother's earlier that week. When I was 16, I was sitting in the living room with my then boyfriend, being silly and taking pictures with a digital camera. Every picture we had taken that afternoon were all weird. There were orbs, drastic lighting changes, and weird streaks of light, and faces reflected in the computer monitor that was off, and the faces didn't belong to either of us. To debunk the pictures, I cleaned up the camera lens, cleaned the monitor, and made sure the lamp wasn't being too glitchy, and took a few more pictures. The orbs and faces didn't reappear, but the weird lighting and streaks did. I set the camera down because it freaked me out, and the next day when I wanted to show my best friend the pictures, they were all gone. All but one, of me and my boyfriend sitting next to each other. Never could explain it. That was about 10 years ago, and I'm still dealing with a lot of weird stuff that's happening in the house I currently live in.